Well, good evening, everybody. Professor Jen here, coming to you, coffee table series, little conversations, observations about pop culture and things that I think have all kinds of relevance, as it relates to media, film, etc. Before we begin, as always, I like to say thank you to Captioning Services for everything that you do for us and how much I appreciate everything you've done for us this semester. We're really towards the end. I'm really just taping at this point a total of six more shows and experiences for us for this class. Um, you know, and then we see the end of our class together to think about all the things that we've been studying, why it is that we tell similar stories, similar themes over and over again, what are social relevance, themes, etc. Tonight, you see in my picture, I want to talk about The Handmaid's Tale, what it has to do with pop culture, influence, status of women, status of men, power and control, etc. I do have to say that this evening I am going to talk about some things, I'll touch upon them, that, I hope um aren't triggering for anybody. I like to talk about issues, as you know, that have real bearing on society and culture and the why. In The Handmaid's Tale, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but certainly Handmaid's Tale brings a lot of insight. And I'll share with you why as it relates to pop culture and why it is that The Handmaid's Tale in some areas in the world, on the globe, have banned Handmaid's Tale. And school districts here in the United States, some of them have banned the reading and discussion of it because many had found that A, one reason is because some of the issues and language in Handmaid's Tale really speaks to too much power and allegiance to feminism. That's one camp. B, the other reason is because many persons don't want to discuss academically the idea, the notion that women are property, uh, women are owned, their fertility is owned, their body is owned, their sexuality is owned, etc., by men. And it just, for many different cultures and societies and communities, I guess these topics are just too much, depending if you're Camp A or B or somewhere in between, the idea of hostile takeover, not only geographically, but certainly of the body. You know, Very often we look at all of these different cultures, certainly in film. Film really does tell the story, especially the fictional piece. In Handmaid's Tale, if you've spent any time with it, Margaret Atwood, she does amazing things where she draws upon historical fiction. She gives us things in her book, which then becomes, a series, etc., that really draws upon things that have really happened, maybe for the inexperienced reader, someone in high school, etc. Maybe that kind of joining between historical fiction and fiction, it's just maybe too much for some audiences. The idea that women have no control over our body. When Margaret Atwood first came out with Handmaid's Tale, certainly Roe versus Wade was in a much different situation than it is today. You know, Across our country, and I'm just going to speak factually. I don't want to share my opinion one way or the other because it's really not appropriate what my opinion is in this particular context. But across the country, there's so many closings of Planned Parenthood as we speak about this particular fictional piece for this class. It seems that there are so many states that now have banned certain types of abortion pills, etc., contraception, post-contraception, events where it's become difficult for women to have services, get services, be treated with dignity as they wish to make decisions that are good for themselves. And since really Margaret Atwood introduced us to Handmaid's Tale, so many things have changed. I know in so many regions here, also in Rochester, it used to be that it was very easy to get a late term termination, a late term abortion. And many people opted for these kinds of services because maybe something was catastrophically wrong with the pregnancy. Maybe the health of the mother was just terribly challenged. Maybe the health of the child terribly challenged. Uh, Maybe there would have been some kind of suffering, etc. Maybe there were other reasons, other reasons I can think from a criminal justice perspective without, you know, making a judgment, just to be objective. Sometimes very young girls are raped or sexually assaulted, and they might be 10, 11, 12 years old. As we know, women menstruate so much earlier today because we have better diets, there's hormones in the food, etc. And maybe in some cases, we find very young girls who either didn't know they were pregnant or they're in denial that they're pregnant or that they maybe were hoping for some other outcome, etc. Just fear alone drove them to wait until the end. And so, of course, there are all kinds of reasons why people seek out different decisions, different choices, that they can make. But certainly in this region and in other regions similar to ours across the country, there are fewer and fewer providers that wish to provide these services. So it's sort of ironic that even though we fight about rights to our body, etc., rights to child rearing, childbirth, pregnancy, termination. If you don't have service providers that are going to be providing services, there's really not much to discuss. Here in Rochester, we've lost, I'd say, in the past 5 years since COVID, we've lost about, I'd say, maybe a third of the providers that were providing different choices. And remember, they're not right choices, they're not wrong choices. They're choices that were available for people to make for themselves. That's really, in my opinion, and I will speak on this, to me, pro-choice in pop culture, to me, means that a person gets to make a choice. It doesn't, I'm not even going to address what the choices are, just that a person gets to make a choice, to me, is really what is so important to have in these discussions, that these opportunities for choice, whether I like the choices or I don't, it doesn't matter. It's just to even have these opportunities. In Handmaid's Tale, another place that's so relevant in pop culture is we talk about women, especially in the criminal justice arena, that often feel dehumanized when they are rejected uh, in decision making about their children. In Handmaid's Tale, women are often separated from their children either as a punishment or some kind of expectation, change of behavior. And so the whole relationship between women and their children in Handmaid's Tale is really very aggressive. It's seems that it's punishment driven. If you do what I've asked you to do, you will see your children. If you don't do what I've asked you to do, I will punish you. You won't see your children, or you won't be able to have children, or you won't be able to have your family back. If you do the right things, whether they're right for you or not, because they're right for me, this authoritarian structure will be able to reward you. And I think about that frequently as I work really a great deal of my career, several decades with at-risk youth, at-risk women, women who have been incarcerated, post-incarcerated women. And very often I think to myself, you know, do we really approach different populations with the same kindness that we approach populations that perhaps may have never been in trouble or that we perceive have more value or worth? I think too in Handmaid's Tale, we have these situations where women have a particular value at a particular time based on what they can perform and for whom. I see this often similarly in the landscape of post-incarcerated women. I see this often as well when we talk about issues of surrogacy, meaning women that agree to have a pregnancy where they might not have any kind of genetic or DNA link to the baby, but they do it for the purpose of being hired. Some people in this country and other countries, they see it as a human trafficking event, even though women might agree that they will carry a pregnancy, that the toll that it takes emotionally on some women is just really a horrific situation. Some persons consider it a human trafficking event. Some persons in this country, as well as other countries, where it's completely banned. There are other countries that do not allow any kind of surrogacy. And some view it as sexual slavery, emotional slavery, uh, fertility slavery. So I think Atwood, it's so interesting to me that in Margaret Atwood's work, The Handmaid's Tale, she selects all of these very, very intense subjects. And I say intense because they're very meaningful. Most women that approach certainly childbearing age, even if they're a child themselves, they're not often prepared to face all of the issues and all of the subjects that Margaret Atwood delivers. The fact that women, though might be educated, might be learned persons, might be, persons that can achieve all kinds of things. If authoritarian structure comes along, sometimes no matter how much preparation a woman or a girl might have over her own agency, her ability to make decisions, the message that Margaret Atwood shows us is that sometimes somebody larger, somebody far more stronger, whether it's politically, economically, socially, they'll make those decisions for you. I think of it often in topics and in saying when we say, if you don't have a voice, somebody else is going to have a voice for you. The Handmaid's Tale, I think, really becomes an instructional piece in so many ways because people refer to it often. It's beyond pop culture because if you look at the symbolism in so many of the wardrobe selections, certainly this picture that I put up this evening for you, you know how I always love to offer a visual, sort of the costuming very similar to Little Red Riding Hood. I was reading some articles about this as well. This whole idea that, going through the forest. Remember in the very beginning of this class, we talked a lot about the different construct of environment, atmosphere. Why do we tell a story that over and over again, it seems like we're going out into the woods? Even in the urban landscape, we're going into the unknown all the time. If you've ever ridden a subway in New York City, it's just like going into the forest, like Little Red Riding Hood. You don't know what's going to be on that particular train, that particular day, and what activities and people and harm you might find yourself in the middle of. You just don't know. It's all these unknowns. So I see the costuming as well, part of pop culture, this idea that, Little Red Riding Hood, similarly to the hood that we see these gals wearing, it's almost like a horse with blinders. You can't really see to the left. You really can't see to the right. You don't have peripheral vision. You don't have that extra information around you. You can only really symbolically see exactly what's in front of you. Sort of, the situation with the forest. I'll give you another saying. We can't see the forest from the trees. It all blends in. These kinds of sayings, these kinds of feelings that we derive from different symbolism, costuming, etc. I think often we tell the same stories over and over again. We certainly saw it in The Color Purple. Color Purple was a wonderful film, came adapted from a book. It was also made into several plays, different theatrical companies. Color Purple about the experience of the Black woman and the brown woman who winds up enslaved so many ways, financially, economically, intellectually, uh, for the purpose of having children, to then make more slaves, through rape, etc., uh, to make more children to work on the farm of the authoritarian owner, the landowner, etc. The whole idea that her life in The Color Purple is really taken hostage. It's taken hostage, uh, right up there with slave is not allowed to learn how to read. The slave may not have all kinds of information, whatever it is that somebody who's owned, another human trafficking event, whatever it is that they need to know, their owner, their master will let them know. So again, we tell these stories, I was thinking about historical fiction as it relates certainly to immigrant populations, Great West, Montana, California, Nevada, and when population first started, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, very similar situation. Women were sort of, put into these very small boxes intellectually. They were called upon when they were needed for servitude, whatever that servitude looked like. So we've been telling these stories for a very, very long time. I might have referenced it before as well, 1920s, 1930s, uh, Aborigine women in Australia is evidenced in the book, which also became a film called Rabbit Proof Fence, and all about how the women are owned and their minds are owned and their hearts are owned. They have really no decision-making opportunity over their own agency, their body, their minds, nothing. They're just told a steady diet of what to say, what to do, how to act, when to eat, when to bathe, when to go to sleep, etc. And so, why is it that we continue to tell these stories, about women and about the ownership of women and what it is that women are able to do when they're able to do it, in this country. The idea of when a woman could vote, when a woman could drive a car. We don't have a history of those same activities as our male cohorts. I think to myself, early 1970s, the very first time I ever heard this, I was really shocked. Very early 1970s, it used to be a law in New York State that a woman could not get a credit card unless her husband or another male in the family, an uncle, was going to co-sign for her to give permission that she could have agency over her own finances and a credit card. And certainly if she was married, she had to have her husband's signature that he agreed that she could have a credit card. That was 1970s. Late 1970s, the same went on when women wanted to take a mortgage for, say, a house, some kind of housing, or a car loan. They had to have their male spouse's signature agreeing that she could not make a decision about her finances and that she needed to have the acquisition of the male in her life and or several males, that they had to agree, give the nod, permission that she could have this kind of financing. Here in New York State, if a woman wants, a married woman to another man, wants to get her tubes tied, she has to have the permission of her husband that she would like to cease the ability to have more children. Whereas in New York State, at this time, if a man and woman are married, and the man would like to get a vasectomy, nobody has to ask the woman for her permission. So obviously, I would say that there seem to still be different rules depending on who we are, our anatomy, how it is that we look at, authoritarian relationships, the permission and the rights and the agency over our own body. Very interesting when you really think about it, you know? So I think to myself, why will we continue to tell these stories, these cautionary tales in a lot of ways? Why are they important? Of course, they're important to tell because they give us some kind of realistic framework, horrible little stories and sad little artifacts of culture. I remember when I was in junior high school, we had health class. You remember health class. And back in our day, health class probably looked a lot different than health class does today. We really didn't discuss much about birth control. And we didn't discuss really much about ovulation, whereas Margaret Atwood discusses all of these things. We certainly didn't discuss termination of pregnancies, and I think they might have talked a little bit about natural miscarriage. I sort of remember that. Uh, and I remember that in the health classes, this was 1970s for me, they would talk all about what happens when you're in relationships with your husband, you see. It wasn't with your boyfriend. It wasn't if you were raped. It wasn't if you were, assaulted. No, no, none of that seemed to exist, though we do know it existed. But in that little world, in that construct, it never existed. It existed at that time and place exactly what we were told, okay? And 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 the purpose of how we were told. Like, I don't remember going to a library, any library. I really enjoyed books back in my day. I still do. But, remember, I come from a time and place we didn't have really, computer games. We didn't have all kinds of gaming. We didn't have personal telephones, etc., computers. So books meant an awful lot to us back then. I can't really remember any other books other than Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, that really didn't approach these subjects as Margaret Atwood does. Rather, just really talked about basic menstruation and responsibilities that go along with entering that aspect of your life and all the things that come with it, sensitivities and different emotions and relationships, etc. So we're really in a different world today. So many young women, I know many junior high school women that are fully versed on The Handmaid's Tale. Is that an appropriate time and place and age to have these discussions about rape, about authoritarian sexuality, about agency over somebody's ability to reproduce, etc.? Those are the questions that we're really asking. At what point do we think that, it's an appropriate discussion, or is it an inappropriate discussion? Certainly, Handmaid's Tale uh, is also a piece to some degree that talks about the traditional relationship between men and women. You know, what message or signaling, social signaling, could we say goes out to a young man who's in middle school that might see Handmaid's Tale? You know, Certainly there's this one part, I don't mean to be terribly graphic, but I'll be gentle. I don't like to freak people out. There's this part where it's all about, insemination and pregnancy and this husband and his wife, in my opinion, which doesn't make it right, it's just my opinion, certainly their handmaid is brought in against her will. She really doesn't want to be there. She keeps sort of having it suggested to her that she'll be returned to her regular life. Maybe she would be able to partake in little treats, having a magazine, having a little dessert, freedom to go to the market. But she will have to submit. She will have to submit sexually. This husband will have sex with her while the husband's wife is in the room. She will hold her down. It's all really very disturbing because in this particular aspect, it sends a very odd message to a young fellow junior high school age, even some in high school age, that, that this is okay, that this is, the establishment of authority. This is how people get what it is that they want. So I really wondered to myself in pop culture, do we have to be sensitive about age? Do we have to be sensitive about maturity level? Who's coming to view a film? Who has access to a novel? Do I think we should ban all things? No, I don't think that at all. But I think different areas, different aspects of society do have to question for themselves. It's certainly not up to somebody like me. And we do have to question, at what point do we allow and do we um, have a need for young people to see these kinds of events, to see these kinds of films, to read these kinds of novels, etc. At what point? So many persons back there with a catcher in the rye. Uh, there were some references from Holden Caulfield about sexuality, about hypocrisy in adults. So many people felt that the character Holden Caulfield was far too negative for what we called at the time, uh, the great young American, full of optimism. Was it the right book? Was it the right selection? You know, who gets to decide? Who decides these things? Certainly in different towns, cities, municipalities, villages, that's why we elect school boards, right? Because we say, oh, the school board committee can make these decisions for us, what they think is reflective of what we want in community, what we want young persons to know about all of these topics, sexuality, reproduction, uh, microaggression, macroaggression, persons that feel trafficked, people that are trafficked. I'll give you another film. I was just talking about this film with somebody today. Another excellent film. It's actually a Spanish film translated into English through subtitles. It's called Maria Full of Grace. It's really a film about women that find themselves in Latin American countries that want to come to the United States for a variety of reasons, and they do all kinds of things, whether it's submitting sexually, submitting physically by swallowing different kinds of drugs for the purpose of smuggling. And it talks all about the idea, same thing with Handmaid's Tale, that how much control do we really have over our own lives if we're really desperate to either have things the way that they were or to have something that's better? The amount of desperation in pop culture that we see in these materials, I think is noteworthy. Why do we continue 14th century, Little Pilgrim's Promise, 15th century, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century? Why do we keep talking about desperation? Notice this in themes that so many of these eras have time and place have these themes and structures about what people need to do in order to survive, what women need to do in order to survive. I think about other film, which I might touch upon some more in To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So we have that one little place in To Kill a Mockingbird where this woman, she had sexual relations with somebody she thought was attractive. Apparently, he thought she was attractive. They engaged in consensual sexual relations. But she gets caught and there's a racial issue that consumes the film, the play, the novel, all aspects, the whole genre. And instead of saying, gee, I elected, I made a choice, I had agency over my body, my emotions, instead, Harper Lee, the writer, shows us that she decides to lie at no matter what cost, because again, the D word, desperation. She's desperate. So through this course of desperation, she winds up costing somebody else his life, and the horrible legacy of losing another life, you know, he becomes equally desperate. He realizes she's lying and everybody's going to believe her that he raped her. And so he acts and reacts desperately and runs away from police, from the court. They ask him to stop and they shoot him. So I think to myself, you know, the topics are so very important. Uh, why shouldn't we have them in junior high school? Why shouldn't we have them in high school? That's something that different communities apparently are going through these localized struggles. Why can't we tell particular stories all at the same time? Why is it that one zip code might be on the forefront of repeating the values of a story, you know, how it ends, all of these intricacies, things that people go through, desperation is a thing, a real thing, an emotion. Sometimes how desperation brings us to a different destination than we had planned for ourselves. The idea of making choice, being heard, having our voices heard. Certainly Catcher in the Rye, certainly To Kill a Mockingbird, The Handmaid's Tale, Rabbit Proof Fence, The Color Purple. The whole idea that what happens when we take away someone's ability to profess what is happening to them, when we take away the ability to allow people to have choice over their own agency, to have rights, basic rights, to make decisions for themselves based on what's good for them. So that's what I'm thinking about pop culture, that maybe it isn't a matter of trend. Maybe in these cases that I showed you tonight, chatted with you tonight, shared with you tonight, it's not really about trend. Maybe pop culture brings us the modern version, you see, of all of these intricacies, but we seem to be examining them through every generation, you know? I'm thinking there were other films, 1950s certainly, you know, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, This Property is Condemned, you know, Tennessee Williams was the author of those, you know, same things. How do we keep our bodies safe? At what point do we get to choose who is with our body, who is with us sexually, to have agency over our own decisions? Really, so many authors have been asking this for decades, if not centuries. So I think they are continuous important discussions and certainly important topics to keep writing about. So I will leave you with those thoughts, Handmaid's Tale, and just the outfit itself, Again, if to look at this picture, you say, why the symbolism of these outfits like Little Red Riding Hood, with the blinders on, so you really can't see, to take away uh the form of the physical body, to have all of this fabric draping. In other words, you don't get to see me, I don't get to see me. I'm nothing until you've undressed me. At that point, I'm yours to do what you would like to do with me. The idea of this big cape, all of this mystery. Who is really this person underneath this cape? Is it modesty? Is it a way to take away somebody's identity? I was talking to somebody the other day about this particular work, Handmaid's Tale, and this person had said to me, who happens to be a reentry person, female, that has done quite a bit of time in county jail, etc., that the idea of the uniform that takes away the form, it's the same thing in corrections. In corrections, as well as the United States branches of the service, military, it's very unusual that we see in everyday form the woman's form, that the idea is to sort of take away identity, That's why we have all these uniforms in prison settings, etc. Very loose clothing. When I worked in prison, I mean, I never thought of myself as, some big sex pot, but I used to joke because when we worked in facilities, they tell us, "Oh, could you please dress modestly and make sure the clothing wasn't form-fitting?" And why are we having these messages told to us even till this day when we work in facilities? Because I guess we are told we don't want attention shown upon us. We don't want to give the wrong idea about agency, about permission to see us as physical beings. I mean, obviously, uh, people are going to see what they want to see, whether somebody has on a uniform, a cape, or whatever, you know. It's just interesting to me that very often in the criminal justice arena, it used to be when women were raped, assaulted, etc., people would say, well, what was she wearing? She must have been wearing something that caused this kind of, crime, this kind of attention, and we wanted to blame the victim. And so here in the criminal justice arena today, beyond pop culture and in law, etc., we say, well, you can't ask a victim what they were wearing. What is the relevancy of what somebody was wearing, right? But yet, in other aspects of our culture, we're very concerned with what people are wearing because we say, oh, if the person is not wearing something form-fitting, then, that sends a different signal. I think Margaret Atwood is really very brave. I think Margaret Atwood brought us different topics that so many people feel shy in discussing. Coffee table discussion, all these issues that are so important and so relevant and so necessary to keep discussing. But yet we tippy toe around so many of them because many of us just generally feel uncomfortable. We feel uncomfortable talking about sexuality. We feel uncomfortable talking about the relationship between other persons and sexuality, uh, open relationships versus closed relationships, etc. So do what you will with this little coffee table series this evening. I hope I gave you some things to think about. Why is it that we keep having these discussions over and over again about things that seem to be terribly important to us, but we see them sort of broached in different ways, different capacity, sometimes futuristic, sometimes fantasy, sometimes science fiction, etc. But it comes to us no matter what. So I thank you for your time as always, and I look forward to reading, all the comments that I see in the class, etc., through chat. I appreciate all the time that you spend on everything, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Good night to you.